Retrospectors, we've been plugging on this pledge drive all month, but something we haven't mentioned yet is our birthday episodes.
That's right. Our top tier members at patreon.com/retrospectors get a special bespoke 10-minute long episode of the show just for them on their birthday every year.
We love making them, and you can gift a membership as well. It's better than socks.
Sign up now for your birthday episode or a gift membership at patreon.com/retrospectors.
It's June 15th, 1300, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
The city of Florence, Italy, was important to the poet Dante Alighieri, author of the Divine Comedy, very much a hometown boy. He describes himself in the Inferno as, quote, born and raised by the lovely Arno River and the great city. So it must have been a moment of great personal pride for him today in history in 1300 when he became one of the 6 priors of Florence, one of the highest executive magistrates. But just 2 years later, Dante's political side hustle would get him exiled from the city that he loved, but also lead to his greatest work. So, some good, some bad.
Yeah, it was something that, being named one of the priors of Florence was something that seemed good and then turned out to be bad, but ultimately turned out to be really good, viewed from the perspective of centuries later.
Yes.
So Florence at the time was governed by the Signoria, which was a collective of 6 men from the main guilds of the city and 2 from the smaller ones. And then there was 1 extra who served sort of ceremonial role. And as long as you were in good standing, you hadn't served a term already, and you weren't related to anyone whose name had already been drawn, you could serve a 2-month term. You'd live in the Grand Palazzo that belonged to the Signoria. You'd spend your days walking around in there. They had these ermine-trimmed crimson coats to strut about the town in. And the fact that the guilds were the only route to that kind of power meant that every well-connected man in Florence would get themselves enrolled, even if their connection to the profession was quite vague or even non-existent. Hence Dante's membership of the Physicians and Apothecaries Guild, even though he was from a family of minor nobility and, as far as I know, had no medical experience.
Well, the Physicians and Apothecaries Guild was also the same guild that poets and intellectuals joined, which might explain that. And though his nomination wasn't unexpected, particularly because he'd already been active in public life and had taken part in diplomatic missions, it did place him directly at the centre of Florence's political struggles. And while there's actually no contemporary diary or document detailing Dante's precise activities on the 15th of June, this day we're reconstructing, it is possible to get a sense of what would have happened knowing about the history of the time. So the city would have been...
You're going to slip into an accent, Arion. This sounds like you're building up
Tread very carefully. We're just on the borderline with Italian right now.
Yeah.
If I was a Guelph in 1300, I might have sounded a little bit like this.
I'll just slip into my Mario accent. And
You ever notice how Ghibellines drive like this and Guelphs drive like this?
No, okay, so the city would have been pretty tense because of the growing unrest between 2 major politico-religious groups, the White and the Black Guelphs, and more on them later. But religious processions celebrating the Jubilee year were underway, and in Florence, sermons would have been being preached, urging people to try to get along with one another despite their political differences. And Dante, who was robed in the crimson of the priorate, would have processed from his home to the Palazzo della Signora, which is now the Palazzo Vecchio, where he would have taken his oath of office and begun his term, which, as you said, Rebecca, was only for 2 months, which seems sort of striking that there was this huge political appointment and then you were out on your ass after only 2 months of being in charge.
So this period in history then, you've got the Guelphs and the Ghibellines in this era. We have talked about this before in relation to other parts of north and central Italy in this period. You've got it all kind of divided into city-states. Each city-state is run by either one of those groups, and basically the Guelphs follow the Pope, the Ghibellines follow the Holy Roman Emperor, and from time to time over the centuries this gets stoked up, right? So in recent memory at this point, the appearance of Pope Frederick II's illegitimate son as a political figure has increased anger between the 2 factions. Because, this seems like an absurd...
Nepo baby.
Exactly. But then you also, and this is where it gets almost incomprehensibly complicated from this vantage point, you also then have the White Guelphs and the Black Guelphs. So all the Guelphs are following the Pope, and Dante's one of those. But the white ones, they like the Pope, but they also like democracy. Whereas the black ones are more like, no, we just follow what the Pope says exclusively. And that's what...
Bunch of splitters. That's them.
There's a lot of debate about in this period, to put it mildly.
Yeah, and the crazy thing is that by this point, the actual war in the Holy Roman Empire that had started this whole Guelph Ghibelline thing had ended more than a century before Dante's birth. But at this point, obviously feelings
and would lead
around...
directly to casinos in Monte Carlo, as we've talked about before.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I mean, obviously feelings about the Pope and the Pope's power were very strong in Italy, given its proximity to the centre of the Pope's power, the papal states at the time. But at this point, as you say, the factions themselves had factions. So Dante's family belonged to the White Guelphs, who are led by a merchant family called the Cherkis, and the Black Guelphs are led by a sort of more old school nobility, the Donati clan. But the lines between them weren't always clear. Dante's own wife Gemma was a Donati, although she wasn't closely related to the most politically active line of the clan. And as you mentioned, the White Guelphs strongly opposed the Pope Boniface VIII at the time. He had a plan to expand the papal states into Tuscany, which was, of course, on the doorstep of Florence itself. And so Dante was not very keen about this. But his stint as a prior had put him on the map in Florentine politics. So when he stepped down in August of this year, the incoming Signoria invited him to join an official delegation to straighten out this whole Occupy Tuscany thing with Pope Boniface, even though Dante was a vocal opponent of his expansionist agenda.
Yeah, and even during his short time in office, Dante had faced this hugely escalating violence between white and black Guelphs, and both sides were using street gangs and mercenary bands to attack one another. And in July of 1300, a fight broke out during a wedding of members of the two rival groups, and to restore peace, the priors, including Dante, made this really bold decision, which was to basically banish the leaders of both factions. It was a classic kind of plague on both your houses move and an effort to enforce...
Well, except Shakespeare hadn't written that yet. That was based on this.
Yeah, right. Yeah, this is the prequel to Shakespeare's
a proto
effort.
Plague on both your houses. Yeah.
But in trying to sort of enforce this impartial justice, it ended up backfiring really spectacularly on Dante personally, because one of those two leaders, the Black Guelph, soon returned with the backing of Pope Boniface, as you were saying, Rebecca, and French forces. And meanwhile, the other one died from illness that he contracted during exile. And incidentally, that guy, Guido Cavalcanti, he was a huge friend of Dante's. And so Dante felt this like personal sense of betrayal, as well as the fact that his political fortunes had then faded. And so this was the thing that kind of sent him into a tailspin where his own political survival was now at risk.
Or to just jump to the juicy bit, whilst he's away on this diplomatic mission, the Black Guelphs take control and they decide to charge Dante in absentia with corruption and financial wrongdoing, largely trumped up charges, and condemn him to death by fire. There's the juicy bit.
Yep.
So then he's like, having been sort of, Florentine of the year, up and coming Florentine on everyone's lips, suddenly he can't go back into the city he loves, because if he does, they will kill him. And so he then becomes, for the rest of his life, this sort of wanderer, really, seeking protection for his family in town after town.
Yeah, I mean, he really was the victim of a shameless stitch-up. Not only, of course, was he tried and found guilty in absentia, he couldn't pay the fine, even if he'd wanted to, which he would have refused to anyway. He was very proud. He wasn't there to argue his case. In fact, the Pope specifically requested that he alone stay behind after the rest of the delegates had left. So it does sound like there was something, a little bit concocted about this whole thing. And so when he was on his way home, he learned that he would be burned at the stake if he passed through the city gates. So he had no choice but to join
forces. Strong motivating factor, that one, isn't it?
A very strong motivating factor. Yeah, but luckily he wasn't alone. At least he had some company, because, the Black Guelphs had conducted an immediate purge of the powerful White Guelphs of the city, so they were in exile too. And he even buddied up with some of the Ghibelline exiles to raise a force with the idea of taking back Florence. They tried a few times to get an army going for this purpose, but it was thwarted again and again. And by 1304, he seems to have accepted that he wasn't going home anytime soon, or indeed seeing his wife and children. In fact, we have no evidence he ever saw his wife Gemma again. She remained in Florence, and she eventually entered a convent.
Yeah, and meanwhile, Dante was trying to kind of reposition himself. It was a classic pivot maneuver. And so in 1308, he began work on his Divine Comedy, just known as the Comedy, in his lifetime.
It's a bit bold to call it divine while you're writing.
This is true, yeah. Let other people say how divine it is. But the poem really does reflect his political bitterness, his own philosophical reflections on what he's just been through, and then this layer of religious visions on top. Immediately after it was released, it circulated in manuscript form among scholars and poets, and its fame grew incredibly rapidly. So even though actually
rapidly
Dante...
for 1300.
Right,
To
yeah.
the extent they were calling it divine within 200 years.
That's it, yes. So he wouldn't have got to see that bit, but he certainly saw it being received as well as it was. In actual fact, it was only a century later that the poet and scholar Giovanni Boccaccio called him the supreme poet and called the Commedia the Divine Comedy. But by this time, the church had come to admire the poem's theological seriousness, even though Dante had criticized clerical corruption within his own lifetime. And by the Renaissance, it was studied along other classical epics.
Well, if he'd waited until 2008, then he finally got a pardon from the city of Florence.
Right.
That seems like a really long time to
It's
wait.
all a long burn.
They're like, look, if his family want to pay that fine and do the public act of penance, then we'll do it.
Yeah. I feel like they could have done that in like 1960. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
What was the last 50 years of waiting for there?
Now,
This episode first aired last year exclusively to members of Club Retrospectors.
Join today and unlock a new episode this Sunday.
Patreon.com/retrospectors